The snow had been falling for 3 days when Catherine Zimmerman stopped feeling the cold. Her black mourning dress soaked through as she knelt beside the fresh grave that held all that remained of her 26 years of dreams. She had been there since dawn, watching ice crystals form on the wooden cross her neighbors had hammered into the frozen ground. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew this was dangerous, that the December cold in St. George, Utah could kill as surely as the fever that had taken Thomas, but the knowing felt distant and unimportant. Her hands had gone from painful to numb hours ago, and now they simply existed, pale and useless in her lap, like everything else about her. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the Red Rock Valley, and even through the unusual snowstorm, she could see the smoke rising from chimneys in town, signs of life continuing as though the world had not ended 5 days before Christmas in the year 1883. Thomas had been 32 when the fever took him, strong and vital 1 week, burning and delirious the next, and then gone. They had been married for 8 years, ever since she was 18 and he was 24, and Catherine had never imagined a life without his steady presence beside her. He had brought her west from Missouri, promising her adventure and a new life in the Mormon settlements of southern Utah, and she had followed willingly, loving him with the whole fierce certainty of youth. Now she was 26 and alone, and the future stretched before her like the white emptiness of the snow-covered landscape, blank and terrifying and completely without meaning. She heard boots crunching through the snow behind her but did not turn. Several people had tried to coax her away already, their voices kind but ultimately powerless against the gravitational pull of grief that kept her rooted to this spot. Let them try again. Let them say their useless words and then leave her be. She had nowhere else to go, nothing else to do. The small house she had shared with Thomas would be cold and empty, full of his things, haunted by his absence. At least here, kneeling in the snow, the pain made a kind of sense. "Madam, you have been out here long enough." The voice was deep, unfamiliar, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas or perhaps further south. "You are going to die if you stay in this cold much longer." Catherine did not respond. Death seemed neither frightening nor unwelcome. Perhaps it would be simpler to just let the cold take her, to slip away into the white silence and be done with the impossible task of living without Thomas. "I know you are grieving," the voice continued, closer now, "but staying here will not bring him back. It will only rob the world of you, and I do not think that is what he would have wanted." "You do not know anything about what he wanted," Catherine said, her voice coming out rough and strange. She had not spoken since the funeral that morning, had not done more than whisper her thanks to the minister who presided over the burial of her husband. "You did not know him." "That is true enough," the man agreed, and there was something in his tone that made Catherine finally turn her head to look at him. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore a heavy canvas coat dusted with snow, and his hat was pulled low against the weather, but she could see concern in his face, genuine and unadorned. "But I know he was lucky to have someone love him the way you clearly did, and I know that kind of love does not want to drag another soul down into death before their time." "My time," Catherine repeated, tasting the words. "What time? What is left for me?" The stranger crouched down in the snow beside her, putting himself at her eye level, and Catherine found herself looking into his face more directly. There was weathering there, lines around his eyes and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, but also kindness, the sort that came from understanding pain rather than just observing it. "I cannot answer that for you, madam," he said quietly. "But I know you will never find out if you freeze to death in this cemetery. You still belong to the living, even if it does not feel that way right now." Something in those words, in the matter-of-fact gentleness of his delivery, broke through the ice that had been forming around Catherine's heart. She felt a sob building in her chest, the first real emotion she had allowed herself since watching them lower Thomas into the ground, and she tried to hold it back but could not. It came out as a harsh, gasping sound, and then another, and then she was crying in earnest, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. The stranger did not tell her to stop or to calm down. He simply stayed there beside her, a solid presence in the swirling snow, and after a moment Catherine felt his hand on her shoulder, steady and warm even through her frozen dress. "I cannot," she managed between sobs. "I cannot do this. I cannot go home, and I cannot sleep in our bed, and I cannot wake up tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, all the days stretching on forever without him. I cannot." "Not forever," the stranger said. "Just today. And then tomorrow you will just do tomorrow. You do not have to figure out the rest of it yet." Catherine wanted to argue, to explain that even one day was too much, but her body was betraying her now, shivering so violently that her teeth chattered. The cold that she had been ignoring was suddenly impossible to dismiss, and she realized with dim surprise that she could not feel her feet at all, that her fingers were white and waxy when she tried to move them. "Come on," the stranger said, and before Catherine could protest he had stood and was lifting her into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. She was too cold and too exhausted to fight him, so she simply let her head fall against his shoulder as he carried her down the hill toward town, her black skirts dragging through the snow, leaving a dark trail behind them. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, though the words came out slurred and strange. "Somewhere warm," he said. "You need to get out of these wet clothes, and you need hot food, and you need to sleep in a bed instead of a graveyard. Where is your house?" Catherine tried to give him directions, but her thoughts were scattered and slow, and she found herself drifting in and out of awareness as he carried her through the snow-covered streets of St. George. She was vaguely conscious of people staring, of voices calling out in concern, and then they were somewhere warm and bright, and someone was helping her out of her frozen dress, wrapping her in blankets, pressing a cup of something hot into her shaking hands. When Catherine finally surfaced back to full consciousness, she found herself in a boarding house room she did not recognize, dressed in a nightgown that was not hers, covered in quilts that smelled of lavender and soap. A fire burned in a small stove in the corner, filling the space with welcome heat, and sitting in a chair near the door was the stranger who had carried her from the cemetery. "Where am I?" Catherine asked, her voice still rough but stronger than before. "The boarding house run by Mrs. Patterson," the stranger said, standing up when he realized she was awake. "She is the one who got you out of your wet things and into bed. I have been keeping watch to make sure you did not take a turn for the worse." Catherine looked down at her hands, which were pink now and tingling painfully as feeling returned to them. "You saved my life." "Maybe," the stranger said with a slight shrug, "or maybe you would have come to your senses and gotten yourself inside before the cold killed you. Either way, I am glad you are all right." "I do not know your name," Catherine realized. "Peter Ashford," he said, and there was something almost formal in the way he said it, as though he were introducing himself at a social gathering rather than standing vigil over a grieving widow he had plucked from a snowstorm. "I am a rancher, or I was. I have been traveling through Utah territory for the past few months." "Catherine Zimmerman," she replied automatically, and then winced as she heard herself say her married name, the name she had carried for 8 years and which now felt like both a badge of honor and an unbearable weight. "I appreciate what you did for me, Mr. Ashford, even if I was not of a mind to appreciate it at the time." "You do not need to thank me," Peter said. He moved toward the door, then hesitated. "Mrs. Patterson says you are welcome to stay here as long as you need. She will not charge you room or board for at least a week. I took the liberty of explaining your situation." Catherine felt a flush of embarrassment. "I can pay," she said quickly. "Thomas and we had some savings. I am not destitute." "I am sure you are not," Peter said carefully. "But Mrs. Patterson wanted to offer this as a kindness, and I think you should let her. There is no shame in accepting help when you need it." After he left, Catherine lay in the borrowed bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the pop and crackle of the fire and the muffled sounds of the boarding house around her. She was warm now, and safe and alive, and she did not know whether to be grateful or resentful. The numbness that had sustained her through the funeral and the long vigil in the cemetery was gone, burned away by the cold and the stranger's intervention, and in its place was a raw, aching awareness of everything she had lost. Thomas had been her whole world. They had met in St. Louis when she was 17, and he had courted her with a steady, quiet devotion that had won over even her skeptical father. When he decided to join a wagon train heading west to the Utah Territory, Catherine had not hesitated to accept his proposal, eager for adventure and confident that anywhere with Thomas would feel like home. The journey had been hard, the desert unforgiving, but they had made it to St. George and built a life there, carving out a place for themselves in the Mormon community, even though they themselves were not members of the church. Thomas had worked as a blacksmith, his skill with metal and fire making him valuable enough that religious differences did not matter much. And Catherine had taken in sewing and kept their small house, dreaming of the children they would have someday, the family they would build together. Now those dreams were ashes, as cold and dead as Thomas himself, and Catherine did not know how to begin building new ones. She was 26 years old, alone in a frontier town where she had no family, no close friends, no clear purpose or direction. The practical part of her mind understood that she would have to figure out how to support herself, how to pay for the house or perhaps sell it and find cheaper lodgings, how to fill the hours and days with some kind of meaningful work. But the grieving part of her, which felt so much larger and more powerful, could not imagine caring about any of those things, could not imagine a future that held anything but gray, empty loneliness. She must have fallen asleep eventually, because when she opened her eyes again, the light coming through the window had changed, grown dimmer and more orange, and there was a tray on the table beside the bed with a bowl of soup and a thick slice of bread. Catherine's stomach clenched with sudden hunger, and she realized she could not remember the last time she had eaten. Before the funeral, certainly. Maybe the day before that. She reached for the soup with shaking hands and ate slowly, forcing herself to take small bites even though her body wanted to wolf it down. Mrs. Patterson knocked softly and entered while Catherine was finishing the bread. She was a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and capable hands, the sort of person who seemed to radiate maternal warmth without even trying. "Good, you are eating," Mrs. Patterson said with satisfaction. "That is a very good sign. How are you feeling, dear?" "Warmer," Catherine said, which was true but also vastly insufficient to describe the complicated tangle of emotions coursing through her. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Patterson. I will not impose on you for long." "Nonsense," Mrs. Patterson said briskly. "You will stay until you are ready to leave and not a moment before. Mr. Ashford told me what happened at the cemetery, and I must say I think he acted just in time. You could have died out there, Catherine." Hearing her first name from this virtual stranger felt both presumptuous and comforting, as though Mrs. Patterson had simply decided they would be friends and Catherine's opinion on the matter was irrelevant. "I know," Catherine admitted quietly. "I was not thinking clearly." "Of course you were not. You buried your husband this morning. If you were thinking clearly, that would be far stranger than what actually happened." Mrs. Patterson settled herself in the chair Peter had occupied earlier and folded her hands in her lap. "I lost my own husband 12 years ago, so I have some idea of what you are going through, though I know every grief is different." Catherine looked up at her with surprise. She had assumed Mrs. Patterson was married, had perhaps thought of the boarding house as a family business. "I did not know." "I am sorry." "It was a long time ago," Mrs. Patterson said, though there was still a shadow of old pain in her eyes. "He died in a mining accident up north, left me with 3 children to raise on my own. I thought the world had ended, Catherine, I truly did. But it had not, and somehow I kept waking up each morning and putting one foot in front of the other, and eventually the days started to have color in them again instead of just being gray. "I cannot imagine that right now," Catherine confessed. "I cannot imagine ever feeling normal again." "You will not feel normal," Mrs. Patterson said frankly. "You will feel different because you are different now. Loss changes us. But different does not mean broken, and it does not mean your life is over. You are young, Catherine. You have so many years ahead of you." Catherine wanted to argue, to say that she did not want those years if Thomas would not be in them, but she was too tired, and the words felt pointless. Instead, she simply nodded and thanked Mrs. Patterson again for the soup, and after a few more minutes of gentle conversation, the older woman left her alone. The next few days passed in a strange fog. Catherine slept more than she had in months, her body apparently determined to make up for all the rest she had missed while nursing Thomas through his final illness. When she was awake, she sat by the window and watched the snow continue to fall, blanketing St. George in white that felt alien and wrong in this desert landscape. She knew the town sometimes got snow in the winter, but this storm was unusual in its persistence, and people were starting to mutter about hardship and difficult conditions. Peter Ashford came to visit her twice during those days, always polite and respectful, never staying long. He brought her a book the second time, a collection of poetry that he said had helped him through a difficult period, and Catherine accepted it with confused gratitude, not quite sure what to make of this stranger who had appointed himself her guardian angel. "Why are you doing this?" she asked on his third visit, when he appeared with a small basket of apples and the news that he had checked on her house and made sure the pipes had not frozen. "You do not know me. You do not owe me anything." Peter set the basket on the table and took a moment before answering, as though he were trying to find the right words. "I lost someone too," he said finally. 4 years ago. My brother. He was younger than me, just 23, and he died in a stupid accident that never should have happened. For a long time afterward, I was angry at the whole world, but mostly I was angry at myself because I kept living when he did not, and that felt wrong somehow. Like I should have been able to trade places with him, or at least grieve in some grand, dramatic way that matched how big the loss felt. Catherine found herself leaning forward, caught by his words in a way she had not expected. "What changed?" An old rancher I worked for sat me down one day and told me that grief is not about grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices. It is about the slow, hard work of learning to carry the weight of loss without letting it crush you. He said the best way to honor my brother was to live well, to do good in the world, to be the kind of man my brother would have been proud to know. Peter met her eyes, and Catherine saw real understanding there, the kind that came from having walked this dark road himself. "So when I saw you in that cemetery about to let the cold take you, I thought about my brother, and I thought about how I would want someone to pull me back from that edge if I ever got to it. That is all. Just one person who understands trying to help another person who is suffering." Catherine felt tears prickling at her eyes again, but they were different than the harsh, wrenching sobs of before. These were softer, sadder, but also somehow cleaner, as though they were washing something away instead of drowning her. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding. For not thinking I am weak or foolish." "You are neither of those things," Peter said firmly. "You are grieving, and grief makes us do things that do not make sense from the outside, but you are still here, Catherine, you are still alive, and that matters." After he left that day, Catherine found herself thinking about his words, turning them over in her mind like stones in a stream. She was still alive. That was a fact, indisputable and inescapable. The question was what she was going to do with that life, how she was going to move forward when everything she had built her existence around was gone. By the end of the week, the snow had finally stopped, and Catherine made the decision to return to her house. Mrs. Patterson tried to convince her to stay longer, but Catherine knew she could not hide in the boarding house forever. She needed to face her life, whatever that was going to look like now. Peter offered to walk with her, and Catherine accepted, grateful for the company even though part of her felt she should be doing this alone. The streets of St. George were transformed by the snow, everything white and clean and strange, and Catherine had to concentrate to find familiar landmarks. When they reached her house, a small adobe structure on the edge of town, Catherine stood outside for a long moment, gathering her courage. "I have not been back since the morning of the funeral," she admitted. "I do not know what it will feel like to go inside." "It will feel hard," Peter said honestly, "but it will also still be your home and you will survive it, just like you have survived everything else this week." Catherine nodded and pushed open the door. The house was cold but not frozen, and she could see evidence of Peter's visit in the neatly stacked firewood by the stove and the careful way the windows had been secured against drafts. She walked through the rooms slowly, touching familiar things with careful fingers, and with each step she felt the weight of Thomas's absence pressing down on her. Here was the table where they had eaten breakfast together every morning. Here was the chair where he liked to sit and read the newspaper on Sunday afternoons. Here was the bed they had shared for 8 years, the quilt she had stitched herself, the pillow that still held the shape of his head. Catherine stood in the doorway of the bedroom and felt the grief rise up in her throat like a physical thing, choking and overwhelming. "He should be here," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "He should be here and he is not, and I do not know how to accept that." Peter had stayed near the door, giving her space to explore on her own, but now he came closer, his presence solid and real in a way that helped anchor her. "You do not have to accept it all at once," he said. "You just have to keep breathing, keep moving forward, even when it feels impossible." Catherine turned to look at him, this stranger who had somehow become important to her in the space of a week, and felt something shift in her chest. It was not attraction, not yet, but it was a kind of recognition, an understanding that Peter Ashford was someone who saw her clearly, who did not shy away from her pain or try to minimize it, and that was a rare and precious thing. "Will you stay for a while?" she asked impulsively. "I do not want to be alone in here just yet." "Of course," Peter said, and settled himself in Thomas's favorite chair while Catherine built up the fire and put water on to boil for tea. They sat together in the gathering darkness, talking quietly about small things. Nothing important, and Catherine found that having another person in the house made it feel less like a mausoleum and more like a place where life could maybe, eventually, happen again. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Peter came by most days, sometimes bringing supplies from town, sometimes just to check on Catherine and make sure she was managing. He was never intrusive, never stayed longer than was welcome, but his presence became something Catherine looked forward to, a bright spot in days that were otherwise gray and difficult. She learned that he was 33, originally from a ranch outside El Paso, Texas, and that he had been traveling for months after selling his portion of the family ranch to his older brother. He had been planning to head north to Montana Territory, had heard there were opportunities there for a man with his experience, but the storm had trapped him in St. George, and now he seemed in no hurry to leave. Catherine also learned that Peter was kind in ways that went beyond words, that he noticed things other people missed and helped without making a show of it. He fixed the loose board on her porch without being asked, chopped enough firewood to last her through the rest of winter, and helped her sort through Thomas's belongings when she finally felt ready to face that overwhelming task. "You do not have to get rid of everything all at once," Peter advised as Catherine stood paralyzed in front of Thomas's chest of drawers. "Keep what brings you comfort and what you think you might want someday. Let go of what feels like it is holding you in place." It was good advice, and Catherine followed it, packing away Thomas's best clothes to donate to families in need, keeping a few of his shirts that still smelled like him, making slow, deliberate choices about what to hold onto and what to release. It was exhausting work, emotionally draining in ways that left her wrung out and hollow, but it also felt necessary, like she was slowly building a new shape for her life, one that acknowledged Thomas's absence but did not let it consume everything. As winter slowly gave way to early spring, Catherine found herself emerging from the worst of her grief into something more manageable. She still missed Thomas with an ache that never quite went away, still had days where getting out of bed felt like an impossible task, but she also had moments of something that almost felt like peace. She took in sewing again, needing the income and finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of needle and thread. She attended church services, sitting in the back and slipping out early but appreciating the sense of community. And she spent time with Peter, whose presence had become as natural and necessary as breathing. It took Catherine embarrassingly long to realize that what she felt for Peter was growing into something more than friendship. The awareness came upon her gradually, creeping in through small moments that suddenly felt charged with new meaning. The way her heart lifted when she saw him walking up her path. The way she found herself watching his hands as he worked, noticing the strength in them and the gentleness too. The way she caught herself wondering what it would be like to be held by him, protected by him, loved by him. The realization filled her with guilt so intense it made her physically ill. How could she be developing feelings for another man when Thomas had been dead for barely 4 months? What kind of terrible, faithless wife was she, to let another man into her heart so soon after burying her husband? She tried to push the feelings away, to recreate the emotional distance she had maintained in the early days of knowing Peter, but it was impossible. The feelings were there, undeniable and growing stronger every day, and eventually Catherine had to face the fact that she was falling in love with Peter Ashford. She did her best to hide it, terrified that Peter would see what she was feeling and be horrified or worse, pitying. But Peter had always been perceptive, and one afternoon in late March, as they worked together in her small garden preparing the soil for spring planting, he looked at her with such clear understanding that Catherine knew her secret was out. "You do not have to feel guilty," Peter said quietly, and Catherine froze with her hands in the dirt, unable to look at him. "About having feelings again, about wanting to live your life." "You do not know what I am feeling," Catherine said, but her voice was weak and unconvincing even to her own ears. "I think I do," Peter said, and now he moved closer, kneeling beside her in the garden bed so their faces were level. "And I think you should know that I have feelings too, Catherine. Feelings that have been growing for months now, feelings that I have been trying to keep to myself because I did not want to pressure you or make you uncomfortable." Catherine finally looked up at him, her heart hammering so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. "What kind of feelings?" "The kind that make me want to see you every day," Peter said, his storm-gray eyes locked on hers. "The kind that make me think about a future I had stopped imagining for myself. The kind that make me want to spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy, if you would let me." "Peter," Catherine whispered, and she was crying now, tears tracking down her cheeks, but they were not tears of grief this time. They were tears of relief and fear and hope all tangled together, overwhelming in their intensity. "I cannot. It is too soon. People would talk. They would say I did not love Thomas enough, that I was unfaithful, that I am terrible. People will always talk," Peter said. He reached out and gently wiped the tears from her face with his thumb, the gesture so tender it made Catherine's breath catch. "But their opinions do not matter, Catherine. What matters is what you feel, what you want, what you need to live a good life. If you do not have feelings for me, if you need more time, I will wait. I will wait as long as you need. But if you do have feelings, if you want this too, then do not let guilt or propriety rob you of a chance at happiness." Catherine stared at him, at this good, patient, understanding man who had appeared in her life at its darkest moment, and slowly, carefully, helped her find her way back to the light. She thought about Thomas, about the love they had shared and the life they had built together, and she knew with absolute certainty that Thomas would not want her to spend the rest of her life alone and grieving. He had loved her too much for that. He would want her to be happy, to find love again, to live fully and without regret. "I do have feelings," Catherine said, the words coming out in a rush. I have been trying not to, but I do. I think about you all the time, Peter. I look forward to seeing you. When I imagine my future now, you are in it, and that terrifies me because it feels like betraying Thomas, but at the same time it feels right in a way I cannot explain. Peter smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. It is right, he said firmly. Love is not a finite resource, Catherine. Loving me does not mean you love Thomas any less. It just means your heart is big enough to hold more than one person, and there is nothing wrong with that. Catherine had never thought of it that way, had been so caught up in the idea that moving forward meant leaving Thomas behind. But Peter's words shifted something fundamental in her understanding. She could love Thomas and mourn him and still build a new life with someone else. The two things were not mutually exclusive. I want to try, she said, her voice steadying as she spoke. I want to see where this goes, Peter, but I need to go slowly. I need time to adjust to the idea of being with someone who is not Thomas. We will go as slowly as you need, Peter promised. He took her hand, folding her dirt-smudged fingers into his own, and Catherine felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. I am not going anywhere, Catherine. I am here for as long as you want me. They continued working in the garden after that, but everything felt different now, charged with new possibility. Catherine found herself stealing glances at Peter, noticing the way his hair fell across his forehead when he bent to work, the way his hands moved with confident precision, the way he hummed softly under his breath when he was concentrating. These were things she had noticed before, but now she let herself notice them openly, without guilt or shame, and it felt like coming up for air after being underwater for too long. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Catherine had experienced with Thomas. Where her first love had been bright and uncomplicated, built on youthful certainty and shared dreams, her growing relationship with Peter was more complex, shadowed by loss but also deeper for having been forged in fire. They spent hours talking, sharing their histories and their hopes, learning each other with deliberate care. Peter told her about his childhood in Texas, about the ranch where he had grown up and the brother he still mourned, about his decision to leave and search for something he could not quite name. Catherine told him about her life with Thomas, the good years and the hard ones, the plans they had made that would never come to fruition, and Peter listened without jealousy or discomfort, honoring her past even as they built toward a potential future together. The first time Peter kissed her, they were standing on her porch at sunset, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost impossibly beautiful after the gray winter. He had been saying good night as he did every evening, but this time he paused, looking down at her with a question in his eyes, and Catherine found herself nodding before he even asked it out loud. The kiss was soft, tentative, nothing like the passionate embraces she had shared with Thomas, but it was perfect in its own way. It tasted like new beginnings and careful hope, and when Peter pulled back, Catherine was smiling through tears she had not realized she was crying. Was that all right? Peter asked, his voice rough with emotion. Yes, Catherine whispered. Yes, it was more than all right. As spring deepened into summer, Catherine and Peter's relationship continued to develop and deepen. They were the subject of some gossip in town, as Catherine had feared, with certain people muttering about unseemly haste and lack of proper mourning, but most of the community was kinder than she had expected. Mrs. Patterson was openly delighted, declaring that she had known from the beginning that Peter and Catherine were meant for each other. The minister's wife stopped by to offer her blessing, saying that life was too short and too hard to turn away from love when it appeared. Even the few people who disapproved seemed more concerned with propriety than genuinely scandalized, and Catherine found that she cared less and less about their opinions as time went on. Peter was offered a job managing a ranch about 15 miles outside of St. George, and he took it with enthusiasm, throwing himself into the work with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. Catherine continued her sewing, building up a regular clientele and taking pride in her growing independence, even as she and Peter talked more seriously about a future together. In August, 8 months after Thomas's death and 6 months after Peter had carried her from the cemetery, he asked her to marry him. They were sitting on her porch watching the stars come out, and Peter simply turned to her and said, "Catherine, I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Catherine had known the question was coming, had been preparing herself for it, but hearing the actual words still made her heart race. She looked at this man who had saved her life in more ways than one, who had been patient and kind and understanding through all her grief and uncertainty, and she knew her answer with complete certainty. "Yes," she said, and then louder, more confidently, "Yes, Peter, I will marry you." They set the wedding for October, wanting to give themselves time to plan properly and to let a full year pass since Thomas's death. It felt important to Catherine to mark that milestone, to honor what she had lost even as she moved forward into something new. The wedding was small and simple, held in the same church where Thomas's funeral had taken place, and Catherine wore a dress of deep blue rather than white, feeling that white would be dishonest somehow. Mrs. Patterson stood up with her, and Peter's new boss from the ranch served as his witness. The ceremony was short and sincere, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Catherine felt a complicated rush of emotions: joy and sadness, excitement and trepidation, love for the man standing beside her and grief for the one who was gone. Peter seemed to understand without her having to say anything. That night in the house that was now theirs together, he held her gently and let her cry, offering comfort without needing explanation. "He will always be part of your story," Peter told her as she pressed her face against his shoulder. "And that is all right, Catherine. I am not trying to replace him or make you forget him. I am just trying to build a new chapter with you, one where we both get to be happy." "I do not deserve you," Catherine whispered. "Yes, you do," Peter said firmly. "You deserve every good thing, Catherine Ashford, and I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to give them to you." The months that followed were an adjustment, learning to be married again but to a different person with different rhythms and habits. Peter was quieter than Thomas had been, more comfortable with long silences, but he was also more demonstrative with his affection, quick to offer a touch or a kind word. He respected Catherine's need for space and independence, but was always there when she needed him, a steady presence she learned to rely on. In the spring of 1885, Catherine discovered she was pregnant. The realization hit her with a force she had not expected, bringing up a complicated tangle of emotions. She and Thomas had tried for years to have a child without success, and she had eventually accepted that it might not happen for them. Now, pregnant with Peter's child, she felt joy and excitement but also a strange guilt, as though she were somehow being disloyal to Thomas by creating a family with someone else. When she told Peter, sitting at their kitchen table with tears streaming down her face, he immediately understood the complexity of what she was feeling. "This is not a betrayal," he said, taking both her hands in his. "This is life, Catherine. This is us building something beautiful together. And Thomas would be happy for you, I truly believe that. I wish I could have given him a child," Catherine admitted, voicing the thought that had been haunting her. "We tried for so long." "I know," Peter said gently. "And that is a sadness you will carry, just like I carry sadness about things I wish I could have done differently with my brother. But this baby, our baby, is not about what you could not have with Thomas. This baby is about our future, about the family we are creating together, and it is all right to be purely happy about that." With Peter's support, Catherine found herself able to embrace the pregnancy with increasing joy. She watched her body change with wonder, feeling the baby move and grow inside her, and thought about the future with cautious optimism. Peter was attentive throughout, treating Catherine like she was made of glass, which made her laugh and tell him she was pregnant, not dying. "I know," Peter said, looking sheepish. "But you are carrying my child, Catherine. That makes you the most precious thing in the world to me, and I intend to treat you accordingly." Their son was born in December of 1885, almost exactly 2 years after Catherine had knelt in the snow beside Thomas's grave, ready to die. Peter held her hand through the long, difficult labor, and when the baby finally emerged, crying lustily, Catherine felt something in her heart that she had thought was dead come back to life. This was hope, she realized. This was the future, red-faced and squalling and absolutely perfect. They named him Thomas Peter Ashford, honoring both the past and the present, and Catherine cried when Peter suggested it, overwhelmed by his generosity in allowing her to memorialize her first husband in their son's name. "He was part of making you who you are," Peter said simply. "And I love who you are, so he deserves to be honored." Catherine's love for Peter deepened in ways she had not thought possible as she watched him become a father. He was gentle and patient with little Thomas, learning to change diapers and walk the floor with a crying baby without complaint. He sang silly songs and made ridiculous faces, and when Thomas smiled his first real smile at 6 weeks old, Peter looked so proud and happy that Catherine felt her heart might burst. The years that followed were busy and full, marked by the normal challenges of raising children and running a household. Catherine and Peter had 2 more children, a daughter they named Clara in 1888 and another son they called James in 1890. The house they had once shared with Thomas's ghost became filled with noise and laughter, with the sound of children playing and the warmth of family dinners. Catherine continued to take in sewing when she could, enjoying the work and the independence it represented, and Peter thrived in his job at the ranch, eventually becoming a partner in the operation. There were still hard days, times when Catherine would see something that reminded her of Thomas and feel the old grief rise up, sharp and immediate. But those days became less frequent as time passed, and Peter was always there to help her through them, offering comfort without judgment. "Missing him does not mean you love me less," Peter would remind her. "It just means you have loved deeply, and that is a good thing, Catherine. That is something to be proud of." By the time Catherine turned 40 in 1897, her life looked nothing like she had imagined it would on that terrible day in the cemetery 14 years earlier. She was the mother of 3 thriving children, the wife of a man she loved deeply and who loved her in return, a respected member of the St. George community. She had survived grief that she thought would kill her and had emerged on the other side stronger and more complete than she had been before. One December afternoon, when the weather was cold but clear, Catherine walked up to the cemetery alone. She had not been back since the day Peter had carried her away, had avoided it deliberately, but now she felt ready to face it. She found Thomas's grave easily, though the wooden cross had been replaced with a proper headstone that Peter had commissioned years earlier. Catherine knelt in front of it, brushing away the few dry leaves that had accumulated, and felt a complicated mix of emotions wash over her. "Hello, Thomas," she said quietly. "It has been a long time. I am sorry I have not come to visit before now, but I think maybe I needed to build a new life before I could come back and look at the old one without it destroying me." She talked to him for a while, telling him about her children, her marriage to Peter, the life she had built in St. George. She told him about the hard parts too, the guilt and the grief, and the slow, painful process of learning to live again. And finally, she told him thank you for the years they had shared, for the love he had given her, for being part of making her who she was. "I still miss you," Catherine said, her voice thick with tears. "I will always miss you, Thomas, but I am happy now, and I think you would be glad about that. I think you would like Peter, and I know you would love our children. So thank you for loving me well enough that I knew how to love again when the chance came. That was a gift, even if it did not feel like one at the time." She stood to leave and found Peter waiting by the cemetery gate, giving her space but making sure she was not alone. Catherine walked to him and took his hand, and together they walked back down the hill toward home. "Are you all right?" Peter asked quietly. "Yes," Catherine said, and realized it was true. "I am all right, Peter. More than all right, actually. I am happy." "Good," Peter said, squeezing her hand. "Because you deserve to be happy, Catherine. You deserve every good thing." That evening, as Catherine sat surrounded by her family, watching Peter help young James with a wooden puzzle while Thomas read aloud to his sister, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the girl she had been when she married Thomas, full of naive optimism and uncomplicated dreams. She thought about the broken woman she had become after his death, unable to see a future worth living. And she thought about who she was now, a woman who had survived the unsurvivable and found love on the other side of grief. It had not been easy. There had been days when the weight of loss felt too heavy to carry, when she had wanted nothing more than to give up and let the darkness take her. But Peter had been there at her lowest moment, pulling her back from the edge, reminding her that she still belonged to the living. And in choosing to believe him, in choosing to keep going even when it felt impossible, Catherine had discovered a strength she had not known she possessed. Later that night, after the children were in bed, Catherine and Peter sat together by the fire, comfortable in the easy silence of long companionship. Peter was reading a book and Catherine was working on a quilt, and the scene was so domestic and peaceful that it made her smile. "What are you thinking about?" Peter asked, noticing her expression. "Everything," Catherine said. "The past, the present, the future, how strange life is, how it can break you down completely and then build you back up into something new." "Something stronger," Peter added, setting his book aside to give her his full attention. "Maybe," Catherine agreed, "or just something different. I'm not the same person I was when Thomas was alive, Peter. Losing him changed me fundamentally. But I am also not the same person I was when you found me in the cemetery. You changed me too, maybe even more." "We changed each other," Peter said. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "I was lost when I came to St. George, Catherine. I was running from my brother's death, from the weight of expectations and responsibilities I did not want. I had no direction, no purpose. And then I saw you in that cemetery, and suddenly I had a reason to stay, a reason to try to be the best version of myself. You gave me that." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, moved by his words and by the love she saw in his face. "I love you, Peter Ashford. I love you in a way that is different from how I loved Thomas, but no less real, no less true. You saved my life, but more than that, you helped me want to live it again. That is a gift I can never repay." "You do not have to repay it," Peter said, pulling her close so she could rest her head on his shoulder. "You just have to keep being who you are, Catherine. That is all I have ever wanted." They sat together in the firelight, holding each other, and Catherine felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The road had been long and difficult, marked by loss and pain and struggle, but it had led her here, to this moment, to this man, to this life. And that, she realized, was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The years continued to unfold, bringing new challenges and new joys. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful young man who reminded Catherine of his namesake in ways that were both comforting and bittersweet. Clara was bright and spirited, always asking questions and pushing boundaries, and James was the family peacemaker, kind and gentle like his father. Catherine watched her children grow with pride and wonder, grateful every day for the family she had built with Peter. By the time Catherine reached her 50s, her hair was streaked with silver and her hands showed the wear of decades of work, but she felt more content than she ever had in her youth. She and Peter had built something solid and lasting, a partnership based on mutual respect and deep affection, and their love had only grown stronger with time. One evening in the summer of 1905, Catherine and Peter sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the Utah landscape in shades of red and gold. Their children were grown now, Thomas working as a lawyer in Salt Lake City, Clara married to a rancher near Cedar City, and James apprenticed to a carpenter in St. George. The house was quiet in a way it had not been for years, and Catherine found she both missed the chaos of raising children and appreciated the peace of having Peter to herself again. "Do you ever regret it?" Peter asked suddenly. "Marrying me so soon after Thomas died?" "I know people talked, and I know it was hard for you." Catherine turned to look at him, at this man who had been her partner for over 20 years, and shook her head firmly. "Never," she said. "Not once, Peter. You gave me back my life when I had given up on it. You loved me through my grief and my guilt and my fear, and you never asked me to be anything other than who I was. How could I possibly regret that?" "I just want you to be happy," Peter said, and there was something vulnerable in his voice that made Catherine realize he had been carrying this question for a long time. "I am happy," Catherine said, taking his weathered hand in hers. "I am so happy, Peter. I have been blessed to love deeply twice in my life, and while I still miss Thomas and probably always will, I would not trade a single day of what we have built together. You are my heart, Peter Ashford. You are my home." Peter's eyes glistened with tears, and he pulled Catherine close, kissing her with the passion of a much younger man. When they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling, and Catherine felt a rush of gratitude for the life she had been given, for the second chance that had seemed impossible on that snowy December day so long ago. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Catherine thought about the journey she had taken, from grief to healing to love. She thought about the woman she had been at 26, kneeling in the snow, ready to surrender to death. She thought about Peter's words, the ones that had pulled her back from the edge. "You still belong to the living." At the time, she had not believed him, had not wanted to believe him, but he had been right. She had belonged to the living, and in choosing to embrace that truth, she had found a life richer and more beautiful than she could have imagined. "Thank you," Catherine said quietly, and Peter looked at her with curiosity. "For what?" "For everything," Catherine said. "For finding me in the cemetery, for refusing to let me give up, for loving me enough to be patient while I learned to love again, for giving me a family and a future and a reason to wake up every morning. For all of it, Peter, thank you for all of it." "It has been my privilege," Peter said simply, and kissed her forehead. "Loving you, Catherine Ashford, has been the greatest privilege of my life." They sat together as darkness fell completely, two people who had found each other in the midst of loss and built something lasting from the wreckage. Catherine knew that their story was not the simple, uncomplicated romance of fairy tales. It was messier than that, marked by grief and guilt, and the complicated reality of loving again after loss. But it was real, and it was theirs, and Catherine would not have changed a single moment of it. As she prepared for bed that night, Catherine paused at the small table in their bedroom where she kept a photograph of Thomas. It was old now, faded and creased, but his face still looked out at her with the gentle kindness she remembered. She touched the frame gently, a gesture she made most nights, a small acknowledgement of the love they had shared and the man he had been. "I hope you know I kept my promise," she whispered to the photograph. "I lived, Thomas. I lived fully and well, and I tried to be happy, just like I think you would have wanted. Thank you for being my first love. Thank you for teaching me that love was worth the risk, even though it hurt so much to lose you. I could not have found my way to Peter without having loved you first." Peter came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. He did not say anything, just held her, and Catherine leaned back against him, grateful for his understanding. This was one of the things she loved most about Peter, his ability to honor her past without feeling threatened by it, his recognition that her love for Thomas did not diminish what they shared. In the morning, Catherine woke to sunlight streaming through the window and Peter's steady breathing beside her. She lay still for a moment, savoring the peace of the early morning, and thought about how different her life had turned out from what she had planned. She had lost Thomas far too young, had faced grief that nearly destroyed her, but she had also found Peter, had built a family, had discovered strengths and depths in herself she had not known existed. Life was strange and painful and beautiful, Catherine reflected, full of unexpected turns and impossible choices. But it was also precious, worth fighting for, worth living fully even when it felt too hard to bear. She had learned that lesson in the snow 22 years ago, when a stranger with storm-gray eyes had lifted her up and told her she still belonged to the living. And every day since, she had tried to honor that truth, to live with purpose and passion, to love deeply and without reservation, to embrace the gift of life even when it came wrapped in pain. Peter stirred beside her, his eyes opening slowly, and when he saw her watching him, he smiled. "Good morning, my love," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," Catherine replied, leaning over to kiss him softly. "I love you, Peter. I love you too," he said, pulling her close. "Today and always, Catherine, today and always." And that, Catherine thought as she settled into her husband's embrace, was the real miracle. Not that she had survived grief, though that was significant. Not even that she had found love again, though that had changed everything. The real miracle was that she had learned to embrace both the joy and the sorrow, to hold space in her heart for both the past and the present, to live fully in the complexity of being human. She had learned that love was not diminished by loving again, that grief and happiness could coexist, that the human heart was far more resilient and capacious than she had ever imagined. As the years continued to pass, Catherine and Peter grew old together, their love deepening with time and experience. They became grandparents, delighting in the children their own children brought into the world, and Catherine took joy in watching the family tree branch and grow. The house in St. George remained their home, filled with memories both old and new, a testament to the life they had built together. When Catherine finally passed away in 1923 at the age of 65, it was peacefully in her sleep, with Peter holding her hand. She had lived a long, full life, had loved and been loved, had raised children and contributed to her community, had survived loss and found joy on the other side of grief. Her last thoughts as consciousness faded were of gratitude. For Thomas, who had loved her first and taught her what love could be. For Peter, who had saved her life and given her a second chance at happiness. For her children and grandchildren, for the rich, complicated, beautiful life she had been privileged to live. Peter mourned her deeply, but he took comfort in knowing that Catherine had died happy, surrounded by love, content with the life she had lived. He tended her grave faithfully until his own death 3 years later, and they were buried side by side in the St. George Cemetery, not far from where Thomas lay. It seemed fitting somehow, this final geography, all three of them united in death even though their lives had followed such different paths. Their children and grandchildren told the story of Catherine and Peter for generations afterward, remembering the widow who had nearly frozen to death beside her husband's grave and the cowboy who had carried her to safety. It became a family legend, a testament to the power of second chances and the resilience of the human heart, a reminder that love could bloom even in the darkest of circumstances if you were brave enough to reach for it. And in the end, that was Catherine's legacy. Not just that she had survived grief, but that she had transformed it into something beautiful. She had taken the broken pieces of her life after Thomas's death and assembled them into something new and precious with Peter, honoring both her past and her future, proving that it was possible to carry loss without being crushed by it. She had learned that belonging to the living meant more than just breathing. It meant engaging fully with life in all its messy, painful, beautiful complexity. It meant loving again even when love could lead to loss. It meant choosing hope over despair, connection over isolation, life over death. That December day in 1883, when Peter Ashford had found Catherine Zimmerman kneeling in the snow, ready to surrender to the cold, he had given her more than just physical rescue. He had given her a reason to believe that life after loss was possible, that the heart could hold both grief and joy, that second chances were real if you were willing to take them. And Catherine, in choosing to accept his help, in choosing to keep living even when it felt impossible, had discovered that she was stronger than she knew, more resilient than she had imagined, capable of building a beautiful life from the ruins of her broken dreams. Together, They had created something neither could have achieved alone. A love story born from grief, tempered by loss, and ultimately triumphant in its affirmation of life's enduring possibility for renewal and hope.